senior editor of the College Wire on the U.S. Today Sports Media Group. With me, as always, my co-host Tyler Natuno from LSU Tigers Wire. And it's been eventful for you this year. You covered a national championship winning team, women's basketball, Kim Mulkey winning another title. Really coming out of nowhere. We saw how the team did the year before, and then they win it all. And now we're going to talk about the College World Series, where the LSU Tigers won their 7th national championship, now just second behind USC for the most national championships in baseball all time. But I want to start off with a quick question, Tyler. I know you went to Florida. Now you cover LSU. So was there an inner battle? Was there an inner conflict for you going, okay, the fandom part of me wants Florida to win, but I get to write about a winner if LSU wins? Like, how does that work for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, of course. You know, it's the school I grew up rooting for, the school I went to versus the team I cover. And, you know, obviously want to, you know, have a site that drives traffic and, you know, brings people in. And there's nothing better for that than a national title. So, yeah, for sure. It was a difficult internal battle. But luckily, I'm not out on the field and I don't, you know, have any control over what happens. So just got to let it play out.
Yeah, and you talk about a team that really, for all year, they were really rode the backs of Paul Skeens, of Dylan Cruz. And, I mean, not to say that Trey Morgan didn't do his thing and Tommy White didn't do his thing. I mean, there were plenty of guys, you know, surprise performances, even pitching just to get them into the championship game. You know, we talked about that last week, but really it was a good series, and it was kind of interesting because you got the first game where LSU wins. You know, it's a low-scoring affair, so to speak, if you look at the last two games. And then LSU just got blasted in game two. You know, going into game three, it was kind of a toss-up, but I don't think anybody saw what was coming for LSU to win so convincingly to lock up that national championship and get their rings for a 7th time in school history.
Yeah, ultimately, I think, you know, what it boils down to. So when we recorded this episode last week, it was in the middle of the TCU Florida semifinal game. Florida ultimately wins that game, wins 3-2. It's their third. They went 3-0, all one-run wins last week in bracket play. So they go in with a pretty stark pitching advantage because LSU ultimately had to burn Paul Skeens on Thursday night. They take Wake Forest to 2 games, win an all-time college pitching matchup between Paul Skeens and Rhett Lauder. That was 0-0 going to extras. They win it. But, you know, the consequences of that is they did burn Paul Skeens. He wasn't available, at least in those first 2 games. But, you know, really, Florida's pitching advantage was pretty much neutralized by the fact that they just didn't get what they needed out of their starters this weekend. You know, I think they went a combined 8 innings. Which just isn't good enough. And it put him in a position where, you know, in spite of that big offensive day, that record-setting day in game 2, they entered game 3 having to turn early to bullpen guys because Jack Caglione had another rough start. They had to turn early to bullpen guys who LSU had largely seen already, and that really came back to bite them in the end. And on the flip side, you know, you really, like you mentioned, pitching, LSU's bullpen, which had been legitimately like bad down the stretch of the season, like it had struggled a lot. It just flipped a switch in the tournament and in Omaha especially. Not really sure how to explain it, to be honest with you, but those guys just really stepped up. And that's really what I think this tournament's about more than anything. It's about which team gets hot when it matters the most. And that was undoubtedly LSU this weekend.
You know, a term that they like to use in sports is these guys were gamers. When the lights are brighter, the pressure is on. They stood up, you know, stepped up to the plate, so to speak, stepped up to the bump, and were able to come through. And now, July 9th through the 11th, we'll wait to see Jack Caglione, Wyatt Langford, Paul Skeens, Dylan Cruz, so many other guys. Where are these guys going to get drafted? And, you know, as we try to follow along with their careers, you know, just
Cags actually isn't draft eligible, by the way. He has to come back.
Oh, he's not? Okay,
yep.
So we'll wait and see next year when he's probably how we talk about, you know, this year where we're talking about, you know, Dylan Cruz and Wyatt Langford. Maybe he's a top 3 guy next year. No, that's my mistake, but, you know, that's why I got you to kind of back me up there. Let's move on to segment 2. Last week we talked about the SEC. This week I wanted to go my backyard, what I know, the Big 12. We did yours last week. Let's do mine this week. We're talking about the Big 12 and the storylines coming into this season, the 2023 season. there's plenty. But I think the big one, when you really talk about it, and I know you're going to get into the new teams here in a minute, but for me, it's Texas and Oklahoma going into the final year that they're in the Big 12. They had that massive payout. They had to swap some games to get out of their contract a year early so they could go to the SEC. Now, for me, can they win the Big 12 in the last year? Obviously, a lot of people don't want to see that. As a fan, nobody wants to see that. And really, when you look at these two teams, I don't think Oklahoma is in a place right now on paper when you look at them, especially with how they performed last year, as a team that can really win the Big 12 this year. I think Texas could. I mean, you look at that offense, they were already a high powered offense last year. They've just added to it. And then going into this year. So, like, for me, looking at them, Texas is a team you've got to watch this year. When you talk about Quinn Ewers, they don't have Bijan Robinson, but they've got plenty of running backs. But you look at the wide receivers, Xavier Worthy's back, A.D. Mitchell. So, really, there are no excuses for the Texas Longhorns to not win the Big 12 this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Texas is a team that we're going to talk about quite a bit as we proceed with this show. And, Texas and Oklahoma, most of the storylines with the league this year really do revolve back to Texas and Oklahoma, whether it's those teams directly or the storylines that are coming as a result of the decisions that those teams have made, which kind of brings us to what I want to talk about, which is the new teams we're going to have this year. And we're going to have, one year where it's kind of a full house before Oklahoma and Texas leave for the SEC. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see just, what the balance of power looks like, at least for this 1 year, even though things are about to change again. But, so you're seeing 4 new teams. You got Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, and BYU. And I think all of them sort of fit into this conference in different places and different niches. And I think, just right off the top, these are 2 teams we're going to talk about more later again as we proceed. But I think I would say that Houston and UCF are the 2 that come in, I think, best prepared to be at the Power 5 level, just because I think they're the 2 that were operating the most at a Power 5 level, before, when they were at the Group of 5 level. I think Cincinnati's a team that can also say that to a large degree, but I think they have more questions than those other 2 teams do. Because, for a number of reasons, but I think Luke Fickell, in his decision to leave for Wisconsin, sort of saw the writing on the wall, which is that moving into the Power 5 may not be what's in Cincinnati's best interest. I mean, we saw for West Virginia, the results have been kind of middling. And I think Cincinnati is going to have some of the same problems that West Virginia had. They're geographically isolated within the conference. Now, maybe that becomes less important now that the conference is more focused on, adding value than having a cohesive geographic identity. And, UCF will have some of those same problems in being geographically isolated, but unlike Cincinnati, it's in Florida, which is a talent-rich hotbed, obviously. And the power programs in that state have kind of been struggling recently. So maybe there's some ground to be gained there. I think Cincinnati is a team that's going to struggle, and I think, or could potentially struggle. And I think a team that is going to struggle is BYU, just because I think, for a number of reasons, it's going to be tough to recruit there. It's not necessarily kind of school that, you're kind of looking for a specific type of player and person to want to go there. And I think that, we'll see if they can make that jump. They're probably the one of all these teams that was, scheduling the least like a Power 5 team prior to joining the Big 12. So I think they're the team that I'm really like, this could not work out very well, at least in the short term.
Yeah, when you talk about Houston run by Dana Holgorsen, who is no stranger to the Big 12, having spent time at Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, West Virginia, and now he's coming back into the Big 12 with Houston. And, by the way, they got a quarterback from Texas Tech, Donovan Smith, who will be running the show. They brought some guys from Oklahoma, talking about David Owegbu. There's plenty of guys that are going to be on that team that are familiar with the Big 12. So I think they might be poised for a championship run, I should say, but they are going to be battle tested. All right, so let's talk about the Big 12. Let's get more on the individual side. I wanted to talk about the offensive MVP picks, much like we did with the SEC. I think we're both going to be looking down in Austin at the Texas Longhorns because for me, when I look at this, I'm looking at Xavier Worthy and just what he's able to do. He had a little bit of a drop-off last year when you look at his numbers. He went from 15.8 to 12.7 yards per catch, 3 less touchdowns, but he was still productive. He had a case of the dropsies, as we saw in the Alamo Bowl against Washington. However, he's talented. And this offense, he's going to be the guy. While they do have plenty of options, kind of who picks up the slack with Bichon Gunn, I think it might be Xavier Worthy, who has as good a shot as anybody of being the MVP of this league, at least on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent pick. And, I think he's probably sort of 1A, 1B with the guy I'm going to pick, which is the guy who's throwing passes to him. I got Quinn Ewers. And, he stepped into a role last season as a redshirt freshman coming in as a transfer from Ohio State, probably with unfair expectations for a redshirt freshman. But, that's what happens when you're a number one overall, type prospect coming out of high school and drawing comparisons to guys like Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence. But he had an up and down year, but I think he started off really hot. And I think we all saw, we've talked about before on this show, but he looked really good at the start of that Alabama game. And if he stays healthy in that Alabama game, they probably win it. Obviously he gets hurt, misses about a month of the year, and that kind of throws off, the momentum he was building. Has still some really bright moments down the stretch, has some obviously not great ones. He threw 3 picks against Oklahoma State, but I think, and like, as we're going to get into, I'm buying Texas this year. Like, I think they're back. I think this is the year to do it. I think they've got the talent. I think they're far and away the most complete team in this conference. And I think that all starts with Quinn Ewers. And I think that if he, can take the leap that I expect him to, I think he'll be a guy that's in Heisman consideration down the stretch.
Now, there is one guy that's going to have something to say about that. Now, that's where we're going to talk about defensive MVPs here, Tyler. I got Deshaun McCullough, the transfer from Indiana, coming into Oklahoma, kind of be that edge rusher. Something that they really severely missed. I mean, after losing Nick Bonito to the NFL, they had plenty of guys on the defensive side of the ball. But I think Deshaun's a guy who can come in and do that. At 6.5 tackles for loss last year, 4 sacks, 3 passes defended. So I think, he's a guy who can drop into coverage. He can get after the rusher. I mean, this is a guy who did have 50 tackles in 12 games. So this is a guy who can kind of contribute in all 3 aspects of playing linebacker, edge rusher. He's a guy that I really expect to have a big year for the Oklahoma Sooners, who desperately need it.
Yeah, they do desperately need it, like you said. And he's, I think the kind of guy that this defense desperately needs, an all-around weapon that, Brent Venables is a defensive guy. And at Clemson, his elite defenses had guys like this. I mean, I think maybe Isaiah Simmons is a good comparison here. I don't know. But I think that, yeah, for, this defense needs to take a leap forward. They made some transfer additions and that we'll talk about more later. But, it could all really start with McCullough, and I think he's a big time player. My defensive MVP, I'm actually staying in Austin once again. A guy who we really haven't seen a lot of the last 2 years is Jalen Catalon, a safety transfer from Arkansas, who, when he's on the field, is one of the best players in the country. He was a first-team All-American as a redshirt freshman in the COVID season in 2020. But he's battled injuries since then. He had a shoulder injury 6 games into 2021, missed the rest of the year, suffered another one last year in the first game of the year against Cincinnati, so he barely played in 2022. So, a lot of questions here surrounding his health. He also, had a torn ACL in high school. So this is a guy that really has had to battle a lot of injuries. But there's no doubt, I mean, when he's on the field, he's a game-changing player in the secondary. Obviously monitoring that shoulder, that'll be something key to watch, but I'm willing to make the same bet that Steve Sarkisian did and say that if he's healthy, he's going to be a guy that could transform this Texas defense.
And let's not forget that he's coming back to his home state, played in Mansfield in the DFW area at Legacy High School, coming back to Texas. So, he wants to show out in his final year of college ball before moving on to the NFL. And hopefully he can do it. And we have seen great safeties at the University of Texas in the past. So, why not make him the next in that long list? All right, now we're going to go into breakout performance. And Tyler, I want to start with you. Really looking at guys who, performed well last year, but who's making a name for themselves as we head into the 2023 season?
Yeah, a guy, that maybe if you want to argue with me here, you could say he's already been a breakout player, is Will Howard, the quarterback from Kansas State. A guy that sort of, he's a veteran. He's been there a while. Perennially has kind of had to step in to replace injured quarterbacks. He did it with Skylar Thompson in 2020. He did it again this past year with Adrian Martinez. And in this case, had to play most of the, the back half of the season, or pretty much the entire back half of the season, leads them to the Big 12 title. And I just really like this Kansas State team. I like the way Chris Kleiman's built it. And I think that Will Howard is a really good quarterback. And, Texas is a talented team. I think they're not quite at that same level. But with that being said, they did just win the Big 12. And now, for the first time in his career, Will Howard's going to have an entire offseason under his belt as the starter, preparing to be the starter rather than being thrown into the role, mid-campaign. So I think you could see him take, an even bigger leap to maybe becoming not just, one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12, but maybe even.
Yeah, they lose a star running back. They're going to get Trayon Ward, but they're going to lean on the quarterback position. Will Howard is a great pick, I think, there. I'm going to go with my guy, Tyler Shugg, who really has dealt with injuries the last 2 years. But if you go back and look, especially last year, in the 5 games he started, Texas Tech was 5-0. We saw the game that he had in the Texas Bowl against Ole Miss, ran for over 100 yards, threw for 240, accounted for 3 touchdowns in that game. I mean, he's just a guy who can – he seems like he's starting to really find his the way he wants to play, how he wants to attack defenses, and really looking at it. I know he had to play backup a little bit, because of injury when he was coming back, and now we'll see how he looks. They've already named him starter. Joey McGuire has. They're going to roll with him. I think they've got some weapons on offense. So he's a guy that I'm really looking at. Like, can you stay healthy, and can he lead Texas Tech to that next level as many think is coming this year?
Yeah, Shuck's an interesting pick because, he's played a lot of football over his career and it hasn't all been good, but there have been bright spots. Like you said, he hasn't really had the opportunity, full season starter being healthy. I think it'll be really interesting to see. Joey McGuire's done a great job of acquiring talent in a short period of time at Texas Tech. They're already, I think, a contending team in the conference. And yeah, I think this could be maybe the year he finally puts it all together, assuming that, injuries don't continue to bug him.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so let's move on. We're going to talk about our biggest question mark coming into the season, and I'm going to start in Morgantown with the West Virginia wide receivers. Really, when you look at this team, they lost Sam Jones, Bryce Ford-Wheaton. They've gone on to the NFL. So really, who's going to step up? Because you're talking about 13 touchdowns just between those two guys. You're talking about 1,400 yards combined. There are a lot of questions with this West Virginia, and we're going to get more into it as we talk about Neil Brown and some of the things that are going on. They tried different quarterbacks last year, ultimately going with Garrett Green. They tried the JT Daniels experiment. It didn't work out for him. So really, when I look at West Virginia, the wide receivers are my biggest question. Who steps up?
Yeah, a lot of transfers in that group. Haven't really seen a West Virginia offense put it together in a while. And for an air raid tree coach, that's a big part of what's going on in Morgantown. So yeah, that'll be a big thing to watch. I'm going to look at the other side of the ball for my biggest question. And we're going back to Oklahoma, talking about Brent Venables' defense. Look, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. It was bad last year. It was real bad. And, it had moments where it was horrifically bad, highlighted by the 49-0 loss to Texas. But I mean, this is a defense, the numbers I got right here. They gave up 461 yards per game, allowed 30 points per game. I mean, that's just not good enough, especially for a guy whose calling card is the defensive side of the ball. And I mean, their offense wasn't elite last year, but it was good enough to win more than 6 games. I mean, they underachieved last year because of what the defense did, and they've added more transfers. You talked about McCullough. They've also got Rondell Bothroyd, a really good defensive end from Wake Forest. They got a guy, you're familiar with, and Reggie Pearson, a safety from Texas Tech. They've upgraded positions on this defense, but I mean, there's a lot of room to improve. So that'll be, to me, key to watch, because I don't think there's a lot of questions relatively about Dylan Gabriel and the offense, but it's not really going to matter if you're giving up 49 points to the best teams in the conference. So
they will lose Marvin Mims, obviously, who was a big part of it, but they do have some guys on the offensive side. And you're right. It's the defense where they have the most questions right now. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with my who's under pressure this year. And I'm going to go with Brent Venables, because obviously his first year, he produces the first losing season since 1998 in Norman. They're not used to losing, so that puts pressure already. Then you talk about going into the SEC next year, and they've got to show something under Brent Venables. You do not want to go your first year in the SEC, and you got all these questions about, can this coach lead us? After Lincoln Riley left and went to USC, and then you saw what transpired last year. the defensive numbers. You just talked about them. That for me, Brent Venables is the most under pressure head coach. Outside of maybe some others that are on the hot seat, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when I look at this going into 2023, I'm looking at Oklahoma and Brent Venables as the most under pressure head coach in the Big 12.
Yeah, a program that's had so much stability, so much consistency over the last couple decades. If they don't get back to where they've been, he's going to find himself, I think, under quite a bit of pressure early on. I'm going with a guy who I don't think is under quite as much pressure, but I still think there's a lot of question marks about. I'm going Dave Aranda and Baylor. And I really like Dave Aranda, by the way. I think he's a very smart football coach. I like the way he's approached the Baylor job. That's a job that when he took it, Matt Rule had kind of already dragged it out of the depths that followed the scandal. But it still was not in the most stable spot. He goes 2-7 year one, the COVID year, which I think we'll talk about this with other coaches too. I think we can kind of, especially when the COVID year is an outlier, we can kind of ignore it. And he follows up the COVID year with a fantastic 12-win season in 2021. They win the Big 12. But this past season was pretty disappointing. They go 6-7. Blake Shapen, who replaced Gary Bohannon, the quarterback who led them most of the year in the Big 12 campaign. They stick with Blake Shapen. He has an up and down campaign, kind of struggles. He needs to take a step forward. And I mean, like I said, Dave Aranda's not in danger of being fired. He signed a big extension after the 2021 season, so he'll be around for a while. But I think he's a guy that pretty quickly went from being thought of as a great defensive mind to maybe a rising star in the head coaching ranks. I think this year is going to kind of tell us what the temperature is on him moving forward.
Yeah, I think you can point directly to the quarterback position. When you have an up and down year at quarterback position, you're likely going to have an up and down year record-wise, wins and losses. Obviously, Jerry Bohannon was a very talented guy. They went with Blake Shapen. So it'll be interesting to see how Blake Shapen does this year, leading the Baylor Bears. Can they get back to where they were just 2 years ago when they were in the Big 12 title game? That is really where we're going to be watching the Big 12 as far as Baylor is concerned. But we're going to talk about who needs a winning season the most, Tyler. I'm going to start with you here. Who are you looking at as you need to have a winning season, or else we could see changes at the head coach position?
It's wild to say because I'm going to talk about a guy who, if you would ask me 2 years ago, is he still there in 2023? I'd probably say he's taken a better job by now, but he hasn't. And we're talking about Matt Campbell from Iowa State. Once seen as a guy that was maybe the top, candidate for jobs like Nebraska opening up, all of a sudden, was in the mix, or at least, talked about as being in the mix for jobs like Nebraska and Wisconsin last cycle. But they end up going 4-8, and it was a pretty disappointing year. They're first without Brock Purdy, who probably the best quarterback in program history. And as we saw, that translated to quite a bit of success as Mr. Irrelevant in the NFL. But their peak under Matt Campbell, they went 9-3 in the COVID year, which, like I said with the Aranda segment, I don't know how much you can read into that, especially when you look at what they've done, in all the other years. And the rest of it's been a little bit mediocre. And like I said, quarterback Hunter Deckers replacing Brock Purdy wasn't great. And, now this is a crowded Big 12. It'll clear up a little bit with Oklahoma and Texas leaving, but there's a lot of teams now coming in. And I think Iowa State could just really easily sort of fall back to where it was before the Matt Campbell era, sort of, at the bottom of the conference. I think they really need a winning season. I'm not sure he'll get fired if they don't, but that trajectory I don't like that much right now.
I can agree with that, all of it. One thing I will talk about, for me, who needs a winning season? Probably the man under the most heat in Morgantown now that Bob Huggins is gone. We're talking about Neil Brown, West Virginia. They got to find a way to win. He hasn't had a winning season since the COVID year of 2020. His only winning season since taking over for Dana Holgerson, who left to go to Houston. When you look at just everything that's going on in Morgantown, they need something. And so I'm looking at them. They need a winning season. Because Neil Brown right now, if you've been reading on College Sports Wire, he's my number one head coach who's under the most pressure in all of college football. So that's why I'm going to stick with West Virginia. They need a winning season. Otherwise, they're going to be shopping for a new head coach in football, just like they're going to be doing in basketball.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely agree with everything you just said. Frankly, a little bit surprised that Neil Brown managed to survive the 2022 season, especially with the disappointment with the JT Daniels experiment. That buyout was pretty insane. So I think that probably is a major reason why he's still there. With that being said, yeah, the leash is going to be pretty short this year. They're going to have to improve quite a bit, I think, for him to stick around. I would say he is definitely on the hottest seat in the Power Five right now.
If I had to place a bet, I would probably think that Neil Brown's gone by week 4. They got to play Penn State. They have to play Pittsburgh. It's going to be tough for them, even to come out 2-2 in the first 4 weeks. So really, that's what I'm watching for. Let's talk about surprise teams, and people who know me aren't going to be too surprised when I say Texas Tech is my surprise team going into this year, coming off an 8-5 year. You look at how Joey McGuire's kind of built that team, and it's interesting because he's taken kind of a different approach to some of these other teams as they're building their rosters. Their philosophy is see a stud, offer a stud. They're not waiting around to see who else is offering. If they like what a guy has, they're going after him. I think they're doing a fantastic job. But when I look at this team, just what they were able to accomplish, really in year 1 under McGuire, and I think it's only going to improve in year 2. I mean, you have to remember they won 8 football games with 3 different starting quarterbacks. So I think that they can get some consistency there to be even better in 2023.
Yeah, I really like everything that McGuire's doing. I think, Tech kind of a program maybe that struggled to find an identity a bit in the post Mike Leach years, but they went into the McGuire search. They knew exactly what they wanted in a head coach, and they got it. He's done exactly what he said he would. He's done a great job. We'll see if they can take that leap on the field, but everything behind the scenes seems to be pointing in that direction. So yeah, no disagreements there. For my surprise team, I'm going with a team that I'm maybe there's few teams I'm more excited to watch this year than Kansas. Just after what they did last year, huge leap under Lance Leipold. I mean, a program that it's really hard to win at. I mean, there's probably not a harder job in the Power Five than this. And Lance Leipold won 6 games last year. Might have been more because they started 5-0 before had some issues. Jalen Daniels, their star quarterback, gets banged up. He comes back, but he's never quite the same. If he can stay healthy this year, I'm really excited to see if they can take some sort of leap this year. And you could look at last year and say that it's maybe a flash in the pan, and I could understand that. But I think that Kansas, to me, for the first time since I've been paying attention to college football, seems to be actually invested in the sport. They're funneling money into it. They kept Leipold around, obviously a guy that could have gotten poached by some other bigger programs last offseason. He's staying. They're trying to renovate the stadium. So for the first time, they're spending on not just basketball, as if they're trying to be competitive. So I think the trajectory here is good, and I think that they could take a leap.
Oh, absolutely. And you really look at their backup quarterback, Jason Bean, who does a fantastic job. I mean, they have talent up and down with this team. It's putting it together. But yeah, they were a surprise team last year, and they could be an even bigger surprise going into this year. So that's definitely a great pick. If I didn't go with my guys, I probably would have looked at Kansas as a surprise team. But let's talk about dark horses, and I'm going to go back to a team we talked about a little bit earlier. The Houston Cougars are my dark horse this year. I think Donovan Smith, we saw what he could do in Lubbock at Texas Tech. There was that wild finish where they kicked the 63-yard field goal last year or the year before in 2021 to even get bowl eligible, and we saw what they were able to do once they got into the bowl game against Mike Leach and Mississippi State. But really, you just look at a guy who can throw the ball, he can run the ball, he can do a lot of things. But this is a Houston team that's loaded up when you look at the transfer portal and everything. And like we said, they kind of been scheduling like they were a Power 5 team. We've seen Houston upset quite a few teams. So they're definitely a team that I'm going to keep my eye on this year, especially with Dana Holgorsen coming back to the Big 12.
Yeah, a team that was waiting for this opportunity for a while. It kind of been, preparing itself to eventually make the leap to Power 5 status. And I think they're pretty well prepared for that to happen. And I'm sticking with another new team for my dark horse and going back to UCF. I think Gus Malzahn continues to be pretty vindicated by what's happened at Auburn since he was pushed out. A guy that maybe didn't quite, maybe underachieved a little bit, but was still pretty consistent in his success there. And he's carried that with him to UCF. Obviously going to be difficult making the leap from the American to the Big 12, but I kind of like the strategy he went with this offseason. You know, they really shored up that offensive line, added some new transfers. It's headlined by an Alabama guy and Amari Kite. And, you know, they bring back their quarterback in John Reese Plumlee, who's a really exciting athlete, a weapon, you know, had 11 touchdowns on the ground last year. So, you know, I think they're not as talented as the better teams in the conference, like the Texases of the world or the Kansas States of the world, or, you know, even maybe TCU. We'll see what they look like. But, you know, I think that this is a team that, you know, if any of the new teams I think are going to make some noise in the conference this year, I personally think it's going to be the Knights.
Yeah, and you look at Javon Baker, Kobe Hudson, you know, guys that we know who transferred into UCF. I think there are a couple guys who can make some noise along with John Reese Plumlee. UCF's a good pick. I mean, really, if you look at Houston and UCF, those two teams coming in probably are the two scarier versions or two scarier teams coming in on who can really shake things up in the Big 12. Obviously, we're going to get into our Big 12 title picks as we try to wrap this show up. You know, I'm going to start with you, Tyler. Where are you going for your title pick? And do you believe Texas is back?
I do, and I've said that already. And like I'll stand by it. You're probably not surprised by this. I've been talking about this team the whole episode. I think this is the year, man. Like they've got the pieces together. Sarkisian, it's time to take that leap. You know, I think everyone knows he's a pretty good offensive mind, and now he's really got the weapons in place. And, you know, I didn't talk about it during the Quinn Ewers section, but, you know, if for whatever reason, you know, Quinn struggles or has injury problems again, you've got Arch Manning, the number one quarterback prospect in the 2023 class, you know, sitting there probably going to redshirt, but, you know, could play if they need him to. This team, you know, weapons like Xavier Worthy, you got to replace Bijan Robinson, but they're still loaded. And if you know, defensive guys can step up, if Catalan can be healthy, this is the most complete team in the Big 12, and I don't think it's even particularly close.
Yeah, we haven't even brought up Jatavion Sanders. It's at tight end. Isaiah Nair, who was gone all last year because he tore his ACL, or in the off season. You know, those are two more weapons that they got on top of AD Mitchell. Jordan Whittington. I mean, we could go on and on about the offensive weapons. Obviously, you know, the loss of Bijan hurts, but I find it interesting you went with Texas, and I'm thinking maybe I should go with TCU. You know, the team that went to the Cup. No, I'm not. I'm going with Kansas State. Will Howard, Trayon Webb. They've got weapons on both sides of the ball. I think they're talented enough, and honestly, Chris Kleiman is a guy who's won. You know, whether it was at North Dakota State, winning national championships at Division II, whether you're talking about what he was able to do really with a team who wasn't really expected to be there. Obviously, they lose the first time against TCU, but they get their revenge in the Big 12 title game. They weren't talented enough to beat an Alabama team that was going out to prove a point in the Sugar Bowl, but I still think they're a team to really pay attention to. And honestly, I would not be surprised by the time this early December hits if we aren't talking about Texas versus Kansas State. I wouldn't be surprised at all if those are the two teams that are going to be playing for the Big 12 championship in 2023. But real quick, let's talk before we wrap this up. Let's talk about the college football playoffs. And I did mention TCU, who went last year. Tyler, do you see a Big 12 team in the college football playoffs this year?
Yeah, I don't think I do. TCU made it last year without winning the Big 12, which is, pretty tough. I don't think that's going to happen in most circumstances. I just think there's too many talented teams. I think, the SEC is going to have, 3 teams at least that are in that mix in Alabama, Georgia, and LSU. I think Clemson and Florida State could both be in that mix. I think the Big Ten is going to have multiple teams in that mix. I think potentially the Pac-12 could be back in that mix with, Oregon, USC, and Washington, and even Utah all looking pretty strong. I think if there's a playoff contender in this group, it's Texas. But just when you look at that schedule, you got to go on the road against Alabama, a Big 12 schedule that's going to be tougher than it's been in past years. I just don't know if I see this team having the record to be in playoff contention. Maybe it's Kansas State. Maybe someone else surprises us. But I don't know. I don't think that I see a team that's playoff caliber this year.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. I mean, obviously they have to go to Waco. They have to go to Alabama. it's really a toss-up when you get to Dallas. You got Oklahoma and Texas. Last year, obviously, was the big blowout. Dylan Gabriel didn't play in that game, but I'm not sure it would have mattered with the way that offense was operating in that game. But when we get talking about college football playoff, I'm like you. I'm a no. However, if Texas runs the table, then obviously I don't think they're going to be able to keep them out, especially if they have victories over in Alabama on their schedule or on their resume. It's going to be really tough, especially if they run the table, win the Big 12. Because how often do you get an undefeated conference champion not in the college football playoff? It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and if they run that table, if they run that table, they deserve to be in. Like that's a tough schedule. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with you. That's going to do it for this week's edition of the College 12 Pack. Make sure you tune in next week. We'll be wrapping up talking about another conference, and we'll see you next week.